This is Haku Global, is a company I co-founded with Kevin Reddy. And our mission is really to help accelerate leadership future intelligence. And today we're talking about neuroscience-based future leadership intelligence and the 6 pillars of future intelligence. And the agenda is going to be why future intelligence is not just foresight, why leaders default to short-termism, why a neuroscience-based approach to futures thinking is more optimal. We're going to talk about the 6 pillars of future intelligence and why building future intelligence is essential in a complex, uncertain, exponentially changing, emerging, tech-driven future. The company name is Haku, and just briefly about this word, it's a Hawaiian word. I spent many years in Hawaii. My teacher taught me this concept of Haku, and in Hawaiian, there's many different meanings to words. On the first level of meaning, Haku means to weave together, like you see in the image, the lei or the rug. On a second or deeper level, it means to orchestrate a song or story. And then on an even deeper level, it means to navigate the future or the unknown. So you might have Haku, who are navigators of the future. And at Haku Global, our idea is that we want to weave together stories about the future to help leadership navigate the unknown. One of the ways we do that is through having a global advisory board. We have advisors from military, neuroscience, leadership, foresight space. And if you're interested in joining that group, helping us weave together stories of the future, please reach out to me. So what is foresight, right? I think a question that maybe a lot of practitioners ask and look at, investigate, there maybe is some disagreement and agreement on what that word means and how it's used. But if I was to ask you what is future intelligence, you might think of it as something a little bit different, right? So hopefully it has a different meaning than foresight. And let's just briefly explore that. So traditionally, foresight would mean to utilize tools and methods to optimize and harness collaborative future thinking. When we shift to future intelligence, we're talking really about 3 different things. More of the process of starting with this idea of the cognitive and emotional capacity to think about the future, that neuroscience component. Then moving into the tools and methods for optimizing and harness collective intelligence, which is kind of the traditional foresight. But then finally also looking at how, this optimizing of cognitive emotional intelligence and utilizing tools and frameworks and methods to then avoid risk, take advantage of opportunities, and actualize preferred futures. So that full spectrum of having this capability and capacity and using it to get results. And today we want to focus in on this idea of the cognitive and emotional capacity to think about or imagine the future in relation to future intelligence. So future intelligence, we want to think of it as an intelligence, just like cognitive intelligence, emotional intelligence, collective intelligence. It's a natural capability that we have as humans. It's an evolutionary advantage. So most animals are not able to think into the future in the same way, into the same time horizons, and collectively like we can as humans. And also, future intelligence is essential for leadership. If we don't have a future that we're thinking about, then we don't need someone to help guide us there. Now, on a scale of 1 to 10, how future intelligent is your organization or leadership? So if you could put that in the chat, that'd be interesting to see what you think, from your perspective, the work you currently do, how future intelligent is your organization from a 1 to a 10? What would you put down? Okay, so Laura says a 5, 4 to 5. Okay, for Peter. Christine has a 6. Okay, great. So yeah, the reality is, at least after doing this workshop a lot and also talking to a lot of people, typically we're seeing around 3 to 5 is the average, just a feeling of how future intelligent their organization is. If you're moving into the 6 and 7s, you're actually maybe you feel like you're doing better than a lot of organizations. And that aligns with the research, right? 78% of organizations feel that their leaders are not prepared for the future. 43% of organizations admit they lack the foresight required to avoid risk and take advantage of opportunities in the future. But at the same time, there's a strong business case for foresight and future intelligence. For example, future prepared firms outperform the competition in terms of productivity, profitability, and growth. In a survey of Fortune 1000 CEOs, thinking like a futurist was the top skill of the next generation of leaders. So there's this futures gap where we know that futures and foresight is important. At the same time, we don't feel like we're really utilizing it to its full capacity. And so there's the question, why aren't we? Why is future intelligence or foresight underdeveloped and underutilized. And to explore this, we turned to this idea of the orientation to time. Interesting website out there. If you Google Mind Time Survey, it will allow you to see where you're at in this box of the past, present, or this triangle of the past, present, and future, and what's your orientation to time. And a lot of times when we think about doing foresight, we think about, how do we get these people together that have their box more in that futures place, and then get them together to think about the future, right? And we think that that's our way of optimizing foresight. But the reality is, what we'll see if we look at the neuroscience is that we also need the past, we need the present, we need a few other things too to really have an optimal understanding of foresight and futures. And so it's not correct that we just want people who are more futures thinking. And if we put this on a linear time scale, this past, present, and future, we add a little bit of psychology into it. The past, we tend to think of it as certain, the present as predictable, and the future is uncertain, right? And then a lot of this idea of foresight is looking from the space of the present predictability into the uncertainty of the future, looking at the horizons, what scenarios, what alternative futures we can develop. But if you ask organizations or leadership, what is a time horizon they're usually using, what do you think that is? If you could put that in the chat, what do you think the time horizon for most organizations and leadership is? Okay, 3 to 5 years for Hamoud. 1 to 2 years for Christina. Okay, 1 to 2 years. So the reality is that many organizations typically operate within a 3-month, maybe even 2 years. 3 years would be max timeframes. A lot of them are operating within I'd say a 1 quarter to 2 quarter time frame. A lot of that's due to the pressures of their boards or demands for financial performance. If they can stretch that horizon out to 2 to 3 years, that's even better, but more rare. But what's also interesting is that 73% of leaders said they should have time horizons of more than 3 years. And 86 declared that using longer time horizons would make their business decisions more positive and affect corporate performance in a positive way. So again, this futures gap where we know foresight and futures is important. We know looking into the future and longer time frames is important, but we're not doing it. And part of this is because when everything's going fine, leaders don't feel like they need foresight. When things are not going fine, leaders don't have time for foresight. I think we've seen that a lot of this past year, right? Where, leaders are in this crisis mode and they don't have time to look far into the future or look at the consequences of decisions. But even prior to that, everything was going fine. They didn't feel like they needed the foresight, or it wasn't as relevant or important. And so the reality is that as we try to look into the future, really we look to the past and the certainty of the past, what's happened in the past. It drives our predictability in the present. And because we can't predict too far into the future, we result in short-termism. And this leaves a lot of unexplored risks and opportunities in that uncertain future. In a Q, which is, I would say, is a complex, uncertain, exponentially changing, emerging tech world, leaders don't know what is relevant and important for developing the future vision or directives. There's an overload of data and information, constant disruption by emerging tech, rapid speed of change, overwhelming amount of risks and opportunities. It's even hard for leaders and organizations to see themselves in the future and what that even means to be operating and thriving in the future. So there's corporate pressure, there's psychological pressure. I'd even say there's technological pressures to default to short-termism. And so how can leaders overcome this default to short-termism? The way I like to think about this is this idea of optimizing the start. In Hawaii, there is this island called Koho'olave just off of Maui. At the very top of the island, there is this rock formation. It's like a chair. And in that chair, the lead navigators would sit, in the traditional Hawaiian seafaring. And the lead navigator would point the ships in the right direction as they're heading to Tahiti. And the reason was because they knew that, if you optimize the start of that boat and had it point in the most optimal direction, then, if it drifted a little off course, it wouldn't have a big effect. But they also knew that if they were off a little bit at the start, they could drift way off course by the end. And so a lot of times when we are doing foresight and futures or strategy innovation work, and looking into the future of our organization and what we want to accomplish, we get a team together, we go through a process, we get results. And the reality is, whatever results we get in that process, we usually accept, right? We think that that's the best results we could have gotten because we got people together and we went through the process. But we asked the question at Haku Global is, well, what if we optimize the team? So we get a team together. What if we optimize them, whatever that means, and then go through a process and get results, right? We optimize that start of the process. And so, how do we optimize the start of foresight and futures thinking? And this image kind of gives you a little bit of a hint here. I don't know if you want to try and guess what you think this image is. So it's not very obvious. So what this is my martial arts instructor. He attached lights to his body and he went through a martial arts form. Okay. And he did a long exposure camera to capture the shape of the form. But what was interesting is that he did the same form over and over again, and he changed his feeling state. So he would get angry or frustrated, he'd feel sad, or he'd feel happy and joy, and he would do the form. And what he realized was after he did the same form over and over again, but with different feeling states, he got different results, right? So there's this idea that we are brains and minds and bodies, we're hearts before we're anything else, and an organization is a collection of these minds and bodies and brains and hearts. And the state of the brain, the state of our physiology, has an impact on the results we get. So we asked the question, what is the state of the brain when faced with the pressures of Q, that complex, uncertain, exponentially changing world, in emerging technology? And the answer came partly from a conference called the Science of Consciousness conference that I attended several years ago. And I want to be clear, by the word consciousness, I don't mean the metaphysical or spiritual understanding of it. This is purely the medical and scientific understanding of consciousness. And what we find out around this idea of consciousness is that most people have a normal functioning range, right? So this is a normal functioning range where they're conscious of what's going on in the world. They're able to understand what's going on inside their body, outside the body, what they're thinking, and social interactions. And there's a normal functioning range that we have. Now, there's also lower states of consciousness, and these are states, for example, when we're anesthetized or we're falling asleep. There's also higher states of consciousness that typically correlate with maybe brain-enhancing drugs or technology, high levels of meditation, or even psychedelics. Also, what's interesting is that at higher states and lower states, on the very ends, we have unconsciousness. So, as we move into lower and lower states, we go unconscious. We fall asleep, we're not aware. But as we go into higher and higher states, we can also go unconscious, because if the brain gets too overloaded, what we'll find out with information or power, then it can become unconscious as a defense mechanism. So, but what's interesting to us today is that at higher states, what we see happening in the brain as we move in this and we push this normal functioning range into higher states of consciousness, we see more power, more connectivity, more novelty, more complexity, more uncertainty, and more change happening in the brain, right? So, the brain is having these things going on, and then we have to then interpret that, from our mind and understand and be able to thrive in this environment as we move into higher states. So this has a relationship to this idea that we're in a more complex, uncertain, and exponentially changing world, and this connection to higher states of consciousness. What's also interesting is if we push this normal functioning range into higher states, what we can see happen is as individuals and collectively as groups, we can probably push to find novel futures, better innovations, better strategies, new ways of collaborating. So I think the key point here is that higher states of consciousness, it correlates with this complex, uncertain, exponentially changing world we're seeing externally, but also internally. And so leaders need to be comfortable with this complex, uncertain, exponentially changing world by actually expanding their internal consciousness. And the question is, well, how do they do that? What does that even mean? And how does that relate to foresight and futures? Well, if you look at the neuroscience of what happens in the brain in a complex, uncertain, exponentially changing environment, you come across this research by a man named Bernard Bars. And he has this theory called the global workspace theory. Some have also called it the global neuronal workspace theory. I want to briefly talk about what this theory kind of looks like. But what's also interesting about this theory is it's now gained a lot of research behind it, a lot of empirical support to show that it's a very valid and useful theory. They're actually using this model to develop AI and general AI as well. So if you look at this idea of the global workspace, you can think of the brain as a blank chalkboard, and it is faced with a complex, uncertain, exponentially changing world. And so relevant content is just fed to this chalkboard of the brain. And this content, wherever it comes from, is going to compete and collaborate. And as it does so, a dominant goal frame or future frame is just going to emerge, right? So there's not really a logical process. It's more just like this random information coming together, and then a dominant frame emerges, which then is going to shape the strategy, innovations, decision-making, sense-making that's relevant to the context, right? So there is this kind of the loop that's happening over and over again. And this is really this process of that content kind of competing and collaborating is really framing what we think is possible, what risks we have in the future, both individually and collectively. And a lot of times, our individual understanding, our individual future frame is different than the group future frame, but we think they're the same. And so at Haku, we want to look at, well, what is this first? What is the relevant content that's being fed into this workspace that is determining these future frames? The first content is the past. This is our memory system. It's also related to our mental models, our biases. They're getting fed into this content of the consciousness of that chalkboard of the brain. We also have the present moment, and this is our perception system. So this is all that interoception, all the sensations and feelings in the body, or things we're sensing outside the body. Even if we're not aware of them, they're getting fed in to this space, this chalkboard of the brain that's determining what the future frame is going to be. We also have focus and attention. So whatever we're giving focus or attention to is actually going to be considered more relevant, and it's going to be heightened in its value within the content of consciousness. We also have values, and this is also related to our evaluation system. You can also think of these values as part of our continuity of self over time, or the culture of an organization. So these values, whether we're aware of them or not, are getting fed into this chalkboard of the brain. And finally, the future, the anticipation system, and our understanding of actions that are possible or important or relevant in the moment is getting fed into this chalkboard. I also have this loop here, kind of this idea of this future information kind of feeding back and then moving forward, because the idea is that a lot of times when we're doing foresight or futures work, we think of, if we just do the foresight and futures, we've done our work. But I think what the brain is showing us is that foresight and futures work actually is just one piece of the content that's determining the future frame. And we need to figure out how to accommodate that properly so it really aligns with how the brain works. Now, one thing to think about, if I was to ask you, what is the dominant piece of content that your brain might look for when it's deciding the future? So I don't know if you want to put that in the chat. What do you think out of these 5 areas of the brain, this 5 content of consciousness of the workspace, which one do you feel like dominates your personal thinking about the future? So Umar says present. Peter says past and values, maybe. Yeah, so I think what's interesting about this model is that it helps us to start to see, what the brain wants, what the brain needs to really determine the future, whether we're aware of it or not. But I think the idea is that this framework gives us a tool to let us see what content the brain is looking for, so that we can ensure that all this content is available, right? Because a lot of times we're not aware of that. And then also it allows us to see maybe individually and collectively what content is dominating our foresight or futures thinking. So the idea is that the brain is pulling this information in, for example, like a systems 1 process, which is a very fast, unconscious process. And what we're trying to do is, by having this model, is say, well, we can slow this system 1 down and make it more of a systems 2. We can be more conscious about the content that's coming into the brain, and we can slow it down so we can discuss it and also analyze it to see if it really is the best content for determining the future. Now, the other part that's really important, though, is context, right? So the context is going to shape the content that's available, right? So, for example, if you're familiar with sympathetic versus parasympathetic nervous systems, the sympathetic nervous system is typically associated with fight or flight mechanisms. Parasympathetic is associated with rest and digest. So you can imagine yourself being in a very sympathetic fight or flight situation, maybe being chased by a wild animal. And there's certain content that's not relevant to determining the future, right? For example, you're not thinking about what you're going to have for dinner in 3 days, right? You're not thinking about what's going to happen in 10 years, right? Or what your dissertation should be about, because it's irrelevant content to that moment, right? But what's interesting, though, is that a lot of individuals and organizations create contexts or cultures where it puts people in a very stressful or sympathetic state. And if they're in that state and then they start talking about the future, they're going to get a result, right? They're going to come together, they're going to talk about it, they're going to get a result. But the question is, did they have access to the best content? Because maybe they were in the wrong context. And we can also see that certain content is not going to be accessible in these states. And you can imagine, like in a parasympathetic state, in a rest and digest, very relaxed, feeling safe and secure, you're going to have access to different content. You're going to think about different futures. Some other interesting research about this, if you're familiar with default network and executive networks of the brain, the default network is associated typically with our thoughts about ourselves, self-reflection, our inner autobiography. And the executive network is typically associated with maybe top-down logical thinking in our external environment or on tasks. And so these two networks can be, in a sense, different contexts from which we think about the future. The salience network is the network that switches us between the two networks. And some interesting research coming out that says that foresight is typically more strongly correlated with default network activation. So what they've seen is when people are imagining and generating futures, the default network components are lighting up more. I assume, I don't know if there's been a lot of research on this yet, but I'm assuming that the executive network is probably going to be associated more with strategy, which is more of a rational, kind of logical, external thinking framework. And again, the brain context is going to shape the content that we have access to. So at Halco Global, we looked at this global neuronal workspace theory, the systems associated with it, and we took this cognitive architecture and we created what we call the 6 pillars of future intelligence. They are context, past, present, focus, values, and future. Right now, we're looking at the neurocorrelates for each one of these pillars, the mindsets, skill sets, tools that are related to them, and also the behaviors that are associated with them. Here's a nicer kind of image of what this future intelligence 6 pillars looks like. And overall, this 6 pillars is kind of the foundation for a Halco cognitive architecture that really shows us how our brain thinks about complex, uncertain, exponentially changing environments and an emerging tech future, how it develops future frames and goal frames that then strongly determine, the strategies, the innovations, the decisions that we can make or think are relevant in the moment. So there has been a lot of, this is initially a theoretical construct, a model, but we've gained a lot more empirical support for it. We've done a lot of interviews with experts. We host a podcast as well, where we ask experts about this idea of what does it mean for leaders to be future intelligent. And we see how their dialogue actually correlates with the theory. We've been doing presentations and also just finished a chapter in a book titled Leadership for the Future. And our chapter is called The 6 Pillars of Future Intelligence. And we've also started working on case studies. So we just finished a pilot with Visa, and we got some really interesting feedback on how this process has helped them in understanding, not only about what the future of their team is doing, but also how to slow down that process and make it more of a systems to conscious, slower process that increases really cognitive diversity, inclusion, and equity within their organization. We also, during this Visa pilot, we utilized what we call the Future Intelligent Design Canvas. This is a framework that really helps us to harness those 6 pillars of future intelligence and the collective intelligence around it to develop collaborative future frames. So we think future intelligence is a unique neuroscience-based approach to strategic foresight, optimizing brains, changing minds, connecting hearts, building and scaling futures. Some of the outcomes we've seen working with clients, increased access to novel and deep futures, higher coherence with preferred futures, highly collaborative visions of the future, high levels of strategic alignment, a feeling of we're going to do this. So I think this is a really interesting one to me, is that a lot of teams walk away from a facilitation and they feel a little bit, I would say a little bit of fear, because they feel like we're going to actually do this. Like we did this work and we're going to implement. And I could tell that in the past, maybe they would have another meeting about their meeting, right? Or take time to discuss more about what they discussed. But they come back to us and they say, we implemented faster than we've ever implemented before. So we see that there's this evolution of foresight, from an example from the Oracle of Delphi, that mystical futurism. Now I think we're right in the space of complexity and emergent futures, but we're quickly moving into quantum AI futures. And in this quantum AI future, we need future intelligence. We need individuals and leaders and organizations to build the capacity for sustained and optimized future consciousness, and to always have a pulse in the future at all the time. Because as we develop technologies and move things at faster and at larger scales, they can have both positive and negative consequences that we need to be aware of. So key takeaways today: leaders need to develop future intelligence. Future intelligence is not just about thinking into the future. Rather, it's utilizing the brain's natural ability for foresight by engaging the 6 pillars of future intelligence. These 6 pillars are context, past, present, focus, values, and future. And when the brain is in the right context and has the optimal content from the 6 pillars, then the most optimal futures emerge, and both individually and collectively. So future intelligence is something you can learn. It builds a capacity to have a constant pulse in the future while navigating a complex, uncertain, exponentially changing emerging tech business landscape. So if you want to find out more, you can visit hakuglobal.com.